This guide will explain the Lippy Froth deck, which I believe to be the strongest deck in the current iteration of the game. As of the recording of this video, CDPR has said they will release a patch which will nerf Golden Froth and Zoltan, which are core finishers to this deck. However, Lippy is such a unique and powerful effect that it would really surprise me if we don't see future Lippy decks. So the core concepts will still apply even if we don't use the Golden Froth shell. That's why I'm still releasing this guide, just with more of a focus on the Lippy package itself and less on the Froth. So let's take a look at the namesake card, Lippy Goodman. The text is simple. You basically swap your deck with your graveyard. But the implications of this is very, very powerful. It effectively lets you play your gold cards and powerful finishers twice, which means you're able to play very aggressively in round 1 using your powerful cards, and then you can reload with Lippy and still have just a strong round 3, whereas your opponents will only be able to use their cards once. Now let's take a look at what I believe to be the core Lippy shell. These are the cards you will always play with Lippy, no matter which deck. First is the Witcher Trio, which is already a very powerful set of cards. You see them in many decks, but they're even stronger with Lippy, because you can use them aggressively in round 1 to win the rounds, and then once again in round 3 as the finisher. Tagging along is Roach, which combined with the Witchers is a whopping 16-point tempo play. When you play Lippy in round 2, Roach will shuffle back into your deck and immediately pop out, which makes Lippy a 6-point play minimum instead of the 2 points it otherwise would be. Next, we have the standard Skellige discard package with Birna Bran and the 2 Heime Scalds. These come with the 2 tier 6 skirmishers and Morkvarg as discard targets. Just like the Witchers, these are powerful cards in their own rights, but are even more important with Lippy, because it's extremely important to be able to cycle your deck to find your golds before and after you Lippy. And finally, we have Royal Decree, which might be the strongest Lippy synergy card we have in the deck. Royal Decree is able to find whatever gold card you need in the moment. For a deck that relies on finding Lippy, this is a very powerful tool to have. It basically gives you 2 hits in your deck for Lippy instead of just 1. Combined with your discard package and the whopping 4 mulligans that Croc on Crate gives you, you're almost guaranteed to find Lippy by round 2. But in this deck, Decree serves double duty. When you fetch Lippy with Decree actually goes into your graveyard before Lippy's effect takes place, so it gets shuffled back into your deck, which means in round 3, you can use Royal Decree to fetch one of your powerful finishers. It's basically another hit on the card you need the most at the given moment. So that's the Lippy package. The rest of the deck is the Froth shell and control-oriented bronze cards. The Froth shell consists of Zoltan, Germain, Golden Froth, and Gremist, which gives you access to 4 Froths in round 1 and 5 bodies immediately with Germain. Froth is one of the most powerful things you can do in this game right now, with the base card giving you 18 points if you have a full row. It's fairly easy to set up with Witchers, Roach, Germain, and also your discard cards like Skirmisher and Morkvarg, and is far stronger than anything else you can do at the same provision cost. Rounding out the deck, we have Demon Pirate Captain, Wolfpack, and Savage Bear as damage cards to control your opponent's engines. We use Croc on Crate as the leader primarily for its 4 mulligans, but its leader ability also combos nicely with these damage cards. For example, we can use Croc on Crate and Wolfpack to immediately deal 3 damage to an engine. Croc also lets you set up 2 wounded units to trigger Demon Pirate Captain's Bloodthirst ability. And finally, we have Bomb Heaver and Dimeridium Bomb as artifact removal cards. I'm picking these cards in the flex slots instead of other stuff like Shackles because I feel that the Lippy deck is softest to artifact control strategies, but with these artifact hate cards, you can actually have a positive matchup against Eithne or Woodland control. Dimeridium Bomb also has some additional synergy in this deck because you can reuse it with Gremist as it's an alchemy card. And if the card is dead, don't discard it if you draw it in round 1. Instead, save a mulligan for it in round 2. So when you use Lippy, the card is in your deck and immediately gets dumped into your graveyard. You never have to cast it or risk drawing it in round 3 with your discard effects. So those are the cards in the deck. Let's move on to gameplay. The general game plan is to win round 1 at all costs, play Lippy in round 2, and then bleed your opponent hard. You can then set up a medium or short round 3, where your Witchers and Germain and maybe a Froth or 2 will be the strongest plays possible. Unlike other decks, which need to manage their resources wisely in round 1, our deck does not mind using its golds in round 1 if it means winning the round. Because Lippy shuffles our cards back into the deck, we can commit our strongest cards to guarantee winning the round. That doesn't mean you should waste your powerful cards though. If you can win the round without spending that Germain or that Froth, then do so, because it's nice having that guaranteed card in your hand rather than having to rely on mulligans or discard to draw that card again in round 3. Just make sure to win round 1 if at all possible, because having control over the length of round 3 is super important in this deck, and you get to play around lemons in round 2 because you get first say with Lippy. And finally, always make sure to play your Witchers. This is super important because when you play Lippy, you want to shuffle back Witchers and Roach into your deck. So that brings us to round 2. You actually want to save all your mulligans in round 1, using them only to put back Witchers or Roach. That's because you're going to use all but one of your mulligans in round 2 to put your weak bronze cards back into your deck, so when you Lippy, they go into your graveyard and you don't have to play them. If you haven't found Lippy by this point, you should probably use your last mulligan to look for him. Though there are situations where you can Lippy in round 3 and still win the round. These usually involve having Burna or Scald or some other draw effects in your hand. The reason we save a mulligan for round 3 though is because you're putting your Witchers back in your deck, so you may need to fix your hand with a mulligan in round 3. Usually, your first play in round 2 is going to be to just drop the Lippy. Lippy will shuffle Roach back into your deck, which will immediately pop out for a 6-point play. If you have Morkvarg in your deck at this point in time, it will also pop out as a doomed discarded unit for another 5 points for a whopping 11 points on the Lippy. Sometimes it's worth mulliganing the Morkvarg from your hand into your deck round 2 if you plan on bleeding round 2 super hard. But other times, you don't need to necessarily do that because you can just use the Morkvarg round 3 with something like Burna or Scald. Use your best judgment here. After using Lippy, you need to evaluate your hand and your opponent's deck. If you have a bunch of your gold cards or Royal Decree or a couple discard cyclers, you might just decide to 2-0 your opponent. At the very least, this will bleed out your opponent's finishers, and even if you fail to 2-0, you can still play round 3. Usually your opponent is forced to at least play an extra card to catch up to you, and more often than not, you can just overwhelm them with your second wave of gold cards. This deck probably 2-0s better than any other deck in the current meta. If your hand is not too great and is, say, a bunch of bears or wolves, then you'll have to make the determination yourself for how far you can bleed, if you need to bleed, and what sort of hand you need in round 3 to win the round. I will generally always bleed a little bit though, because most decks right now rely on a long round to win, and we can disrupt their strategy pretty easily and rely on our Witchers in a shorter round. If you can somehow win round 1 on even, that makes the bleeding decision a lot easier, because you can force your opponent down cards with relative ease, so coin flip matters a lot in this deck. Round 3 is usually pretty self-explanatory. You need to find your Witchers and play them if you didn't already in round 2. If you have Germain, that also works really well with some Froths. If you bled really well in round 2, that means Witchers plus Germain and some Froths should be able to win round 3 pretty easily. If you committed to the 2-0 in round 2 by playing Witchers or Germain and all your Froths, then round 3 can be a little bit awkward, but usually your opponent also doesn't have much going on, since they had to use all their powerful cards to win round 2. The matchups for this deck look fairly similar. There isn't really any matchups in the current meta that I'm afraid to bleed. The main way the deck loses is if you somehow lose round 1, or if your opponent is just playing a ton of hate cards like Yurden or Regis, or even Lacerate. But even against decks specifically teched against Lippy, I found I can actually still maintain like at least a 50% win rate just by playing around these cards, ensuring I don't give my opponent max value, and forcing my opponent to use those cards in awkward situations. For cards like Scorch, Epidemic, and Shiru, where they want to line up your units to be the same power, you can actually use Croc to desync your units. So a cool thing I tend to do against, say, the Ithne control deck is, when I play my Witchers, I'll use Croc to ping one of those units, so that if they want to Epidemic me, they're going to need to use all their Ithne charges to line everything up to 3. They can still get their epidemic off, but now I have some leeway to stagger my units because they're forced to use all their Ithne charges. The same principle applies for Shiru and Scourge, and even Igni to some extent. Force your opponent to use more resources than they would like to get the value. It is especially important to bleed these control decks to 0, because the shorter the round, the weaker their artifacts and their epidemics and the Scourges are. With my artifact techs, I actually have a positive win rate against Ithne control. The other two popular hate cards you might encounter are Regis and Yrden. Regis is a bit tricky to play around. If you play a bunch of cards and then play your Germain, they're almost guaranteed to immediately Regis and get a ton of value. So I've actually started to just play my Germain as the first card in the round if I suspect a Regis. This is because if they don't Regis, I can immediately Froth to gain 10 points of value and put my Germain cows outside of Regis range. If they do Regis, they've already used one of their most powerful cards against you for trading basically 1-to-1 value, and they won't have it for round 3, where you can then just drop your Germain again for full value without any fear. And lastly, Yrden is tricky. If you commit too many froths to a round, Yrden can punish you immediately by invalidating all of those froths with one card. Your opponent will likely save it for round 3 instead of using it in round 1. That is why it is imperative for you to either bleed it out round 2 or set up a round 3 that does not rely on froths. This is one of those weird situations where strategic passing in round 1 or 2 might be necessary, where you force your opponent to use their Yrden or go down severely in card advantage. I've spent this long talking about hate cards because, left to its own devices, this deck will just win the game against any fair deck. So remember, win round 1, play around hate cards, bleed or just try to 2-0 round 2, and profit. If you want to play a truly degenerate deck before they make the hotfix, then I strongly recommend trying out Lippy Froth. It's certainly the most fun I've had playing Homecoming so far.